Hello, it's me, Mr. Fowler. Welcome to another session of English 5005, 103, or 103, 5005. I'm so happy that you are here with me today. I hope you enjoyed the Super Bowl this past weekend, or at least perhaps the commercials if you weren't engaged with the game itself. But today we have a whole new week of material. And since I didn't ask for a draft over Super Bowl weekend, I'm going to have to ask for a draft this weekend, which I know is kind of a hit depending on how you feel situation because it's Valentine's Day weekend. So if you have big Valentine's plans this weekend, I'm going to have to ask you to try to get them done and accounted for before this paper is due. However, Valentine's Day does fall on Sunday. So between Friday and the actual day of Valentine's, there should be enough time to get things squared away and still have some fun or spend time with your family or your loved ones or just that special someone in your life who may be looking forward to that fun occasion. Okay, without further ado, let's get to it. I'm going to lose my wonderful face for a few seconds, but you should still hear these dulcet tones coming at you through the magic of the Zoom chat. So I'm going to stop the video, and then I'm going to share my screen. And we're going to begin, as we do each session, with a review and a preview. So as we review week 3, remember that we took a look last week at the student sample of the self-assessment essay. Then we did a little bit of work with grammar, specifically focusing on comma. Then you used some time to discuss the Sixers and how they're similar to and different from contemporary plagiarists. Then I asked you to spend some time working on a self-assessment for the upcoming essay. And I already got one really good draft submitted, so that was excellent. Okay, so for today, we want to prepare yourselves or prepare you all for another Zoom presentation, this one focusing on our text, Ready Player One. And then I want to speak a little bit about outlining and whether or not that's a strategy that you might want to use for your particular paper. Now, I don't assign outlines as part of a project, but for some people, they really do help to establish the core components of what goes into a good paper. So that may be a development technique or trick that you want to use, or maybe just experiment with using during this draft week. So we'll talk a little bit about outlining and discuss whether or not you have questions about Ready Player One. Since we're going into a draft week, I do have another discussion for you all to participate in, but this is a fairly open-ended assignment. I am asking you to simply free write this week. And for your free writing exercise on the thread of discussion, just discuss your strategies for doing well during the self-assessment essay, along with concerns you have, if any, about the assignment itself. And then, of course, sometime as this week unfolds, I think that if you want to do it in 10-minute increments over the space of the next 5 days, or if you want to just spend 50 minutes today and maybe 50 minutes later this week composing a self-assessment essay, I think that would be an excellent way to use your time. Remember that it is due this Friday, February 12th at midnight, okay, 11:59 p.m. precisely. That way I don't have to worry about someone straggling over into the weekend. And then, of course, that means if you turn your self-assessment draft in this week, you really have the weekend off, so to speak, from this class at least. So just think about how you want to approach the peer review analysis. That'll be our main focus for next week's class. And then, of course, we'll be moving on to our second written assignment. So let's quickly talk about this idea of outlining and whether or not it works for you. Then we'll go ahead and get into the discussions over Ready Player One. So I'm going to share my screen with you once again, and I'm going to look at the template first. So what you're seeing here is the Kishwaukee College outline template. And this is available for you on Desire to Learn as a downloadable document, and I'll include a link into our week 4 discourse announcement that you can use to create a piece of work yourself. You can put in all of these things like Mr. Fowler, project. This one would be self-assessment. You can even put your name here, I believe, student. We'll just give it a generic title. And this is an outline template that you can use for a brief outline, or you can use as a sentence outline, as you see here. So you can actually write a full topic sentence, a hook, and then create a thesis, right? Typically, the topic sentence would go there instead of a hook. Save that for next time so I don't have to do this again. But a hook, there are usually 5 different hooks or attention getters that writers use, and they're very much the same strategies that you might use in speech. So if you have speech this semester, you may find some of this to be repetitive. But you could always start with a startling fact or a statistic. You could use a personal anecdote or joke that's relevant to the topic you're discussing. You could ask a question. Now, caution about number 3. If you ask a question, you should probably answer the question before the essay concludes. So, in addition to the first 3, which I'll just reiterate quickly, are use a startling fact or quotation, or ask a question. You can also think about a unique way to startle someone. That's kind of akin to a fact, but you could go with a more dry recitation of just interesting factual information that might give you a good lead-in to a paper topic. So a startling fact or a statistic, a personal anecdote, ask a question, tell a joke, or you could just start in with typical sentence, a dry fragment. One of the only times that a fragment might be an interesting sort of hook to grab the reader's attention. Typically, I would get my instructor's permission if I was writing that for a paper outside of this class or any other writing class. But if you want to experiment with using a fragment, like a one-word fragment to make a statement, you have my permission to experiment with that for this particular essay only. So again, 4 or 5 different ways to open up a sentence. Then you write your topic sentence. The topic sentence controls the reader's attention and explains what this particular paragraph, in this case the introductory paragraph, is trying to do. Okay, so your topic sentence, we'll just change that to blue, tells us what this introductory paragraph is about. And then of course you have your main idea, also known as your thesis. And your thesis tells you what the objective is for your reader to understand. In other words, it informs the reader about your purpose for the entire essay. Now, beyond this, all the body paragraphs share various components, such as, once again, your topic sentence, your paragraph goal, okay, would be, again, sort of akin to a minor thesis statement. And then direct quotes and in-text citations, along with any indirect references or in-text citations for your MLA page. Now, we're not going to need these for this particular essay. So you can either just strike through them like that, or highlight them and delete them for the purposes of this particular exercise, of this particular essay, shall we say. Now, you can also create a transition sentence, which leads into the next paragraph and maybe even signals a little bit about the main purpose of that body paragraph which follows. Now, typically, can I say typically enough? Usually, we'll try for the sake of variety, an introductory paragraph has a funnel type of structure where you start with really broad general information and you go down to a specific purpose, in this case, the thesis. And we'll turn this purple for consistency of color. Paragraphs tend to have kind of an I structure moving from one point to the next. And you can see that those repeat as many times as you need for this particular component. As it says here, if you should need more paragraphs, you can always attach another sheet of paper or copy and paste the paragraph goal here. You can simply copy this and paste another one. And then you just change this from 5 to 6. You use as many paragraphs or as few as you need for this particular assignment. But you should have a concluding paragraph. Now, again, typically, one of my favorite words, a concluding paragraph inverts the funnel or cone to represent a pyramid type of structure. So in a pyramid, again, you start with a very specific summary paragraph or summary sentence where you essentially re-edit or redesign your thesis. You approach your thesis in a new way. So you start with very specific information and then you expand to a more general conclusion. The reminder is kind of like the opposite of the topic sentence, and your concluding remark is where you, again, remind your audience what your purpose was in writing. So you summarize your key points that you developed so far in the component. Okay, let me share now an example of how this might work for you. So here's a student, and I'll make this a little larger for our purposes. Now, whoops, maybe not that large. I've left their name and other materials private for the purposes of demonstration, but this is a real outline that a student worked with or created, and that I helped them work with in a writing lab. So you can see here for their topic sentence, again, we're going to have that probably in yellow. They're using a direct opinion. And they say that cell phones can be used to exchange all kinds of information. However, this information should be treated as private. And then they develop a hook. They give a famous quotation about Hans Christian Andersen. And then they expand on that. The main idea or thesis, which is in blue here, is that the state and federal government should not be allowed to access personal information vis-a-vis a cell phone. So the student had to write an opinion paper or an argumentative style of paper. And their position was that cellular phone data, once collected after an arrest, should not be allowed to be harnessed by the local and federal governments in order to compound the problems that a suspect might face. So in other words, if you're picked up on suspicion of dealing drugs and you have your cell phone on you, and that cell phone had information which could be construed or may even in fact be a pre-registered time and place to meet in order to sell some drugs, this information could be used by the police to prosecute a suspect, or it could even be used to set up a sting operation to pull in more suspects. There is a school of thought that this violates someone's privacy because under the Constitution, they are assumed innocent until they are proven to be guilty. To then compromise their privacy, even if it's a private matter that is illegal, creates some legal gray area and has become the spark for some litigation regarding whether or not using cell phone data is in violation of someone's privacy, especially if that private information is posted on a social media site or account in addition to being an email. Then you've got a real conundrum. If it's posted in a public space, it should be public, therefore not private, and therefore not a violation of one's privacy rights. So again, that's what this particular student is focusing on. Later in the semester, you'll write a similar paper asking you to take up a position about one of the subjects that we're going to discuss in reference to our text. So for paragraph 1, you have a topic sentence here. The United States is one of the forerunners in establishing humanitarian rights for its citizens. The goal of the paragraph is to illustrate how much of a violation of privacy this kind of information gathering really is. And then we transition. It's frightening to acknowledge the fact that many Americans are so quick to give up their right to privacy under the assumption that the state and local government are collecting information from the so-called bad guys. And then he transitions in paragraph 2 by saying that on August 22nd, 2009, the rights of a so-called bad guy, David Riley of California, were called into question. He was stopped by police due to a lapsed tag on his Lexus. When the officers who had stopped Mr. Riley performed a search, 2 concealed firearms were found. Additionally, his cell phone was seized, and this is where things become interesting. In providing background for the relevant cases leading up to the Supreme Court cases, the reader will have more establishing information available so that he or she can better understand what is at stake. And then we have some indirect references, we have an in-text citation, and a transition sentence for the next paragraph. Now, I'm not going to sit here and read the entire piece to you, but you can see how this student used the structure to create a pretty lengthy and complete essay in and of itself. And then you have, a concluding paragraph. So I'll let you look at that example. And one of the nice things about using a sentence outline sort of paragraph is that when you're done, you basically have written a paper, but you've just done it in shorthand. Again, are all students going to use this? Probably not, would be my guess. But if this is going to be of interest to you, or you think it just might be helpful, that's another resource that you can call upon in preparation for this paper assignment. Okay, let's transition now to Ready Player One. Now, for these PowerPoints, I'm going to quickly walk you through the content up to Chapter 5 and just note some things along the way that you may have missed or you weren't too sure about. So, as it says here, welcome to 2045. And then you see a picture of the stacks in the background and our erstwhile hero, Wade Watts. And as it says here, the book begins with a description of James Halliday's funeral. And the funeral in question is accompanied by a song called Dead Man's Party by Oingo Boingo. Now, if you're not familiar with Dead Man's Party or Oingo Boingo, you can look them up. It's a great song. If the sound of the singer's voice is familiar, that's because he is Danny Elfman, composer for many Hollywood films, but more importantly, in terms of his voice work, he's known as the voice of Jack Skellington from the animated short Tim Burton's Nightmare Before Christmas. So that's Jack Skellington singing Dead Man's Party, if you can dig that. And there's a fascinating line in that song, which says that everybody's coming, just leave your body at the door. And I think that's a pretty interesting way to begin this book, because in many ways in our own world, we're being asked to leave our bodies virtually at a door to some extent and step into a space that's occupied by the web. I mean, this whole class is a virtual space for learning. And if you look at the comparisons between our own 2021 and Wade's world of 2045, there are some shocking similarities for a novel of science fiction fantasy with our own contemporary period. Today, in 2021, we have climate trouble. There are a lot of issues related to pollution, related to global warming, other phenomenon that are suggesting we may not have been the best stewards of our world. In 2045, climate trouble is still an issue. Today, we are witnessing another wave of civil unrest, not unlike what we saw in the early and middle period of the 1960s. In 2045, civil unrest has kind of given way to a form of escapism thanks to the Oasis. In 2021, we find ourselves still actively occupying various areas in the Middle East and other areas of potential war, leading to a state of perpetual war, perpetual battle. And in Wade's world, yes, he makes reference to perpetual war and oil wars specifically still going on in 2045. In 2021, thanks to the COVID-19 outbreak and some other issues, we're witnessing school systems that are reeling a little bit. And this is in light of an already ailing school system that's perhaps not as mutually beneficial for everyone as it would be ideally. We see this sort of replaced in 2045 with the option for virtual learning through the OASIS school system, which offers a better alternative. At least it's better in Wade's perspective, which I find particularly interesting. We see high unemployment rates leading to needs for government assistance, and again, additional unemployment rates going on in Wade's world, as well as mentions of a pandemic, which of course we are currently in the throes of, and we're hopefully near the end of. So the place that many of these people go to escape this terrible world is the Oasis. And it's created by a man named James Halliday. Now, James Halliday has a lot of different reference points to his life that is shared amongst various creative individuals. The first is Warren Robinett. He was a video game inventor, and he designed the first video game with an Easter egg, which is of course clearly referenced by Halliday's Easter egg hunt in the novel. And that title was, of course, Adventure for the Atari 2600. But Halliday also shares some creative linkages to people like Bill Gates and his associate, Paul Allen, in the creation of a multi-million-dollar company. Specifically, even though Warren Robinett created a video game, and that was very similar to the kinds of work that Halliday does in the book, Gates and Allen created a company in Gregarious Games that's a little bit more akin to something like Microsoft. Their direct competition, Steve Wozniak and Steve Jobs, of course, recall their earlier years working in the garage of James Morrow. Sorry, it's not James Morrow. It's James Halliday and his partner, Edgar Morrow, who are, again, they worked out of Morrow's garage, I believe. And more specifically, Morrow's residence, which we'll find out later is in Portland, Oregon, is one of the starting points for Apple computers. But there's also a creative aspect to their partnership and some creative tension referenced in the work of the Beatles' two famous frontmen, John Lennon and Paul McCartney. But moreover, Richard Garriott, the man here in the middle, who probably the fewest of you are aware of or know, was the creator of a series of games called the Ultima Games series. And he is actually the closest basis for a real life version of James Halliday. So a little food for thought about James Halliday. Now, we'll get into this a little bit in more detail in Chapter 5, but essentially the quest that inspired the hunt was this contest, a real-life contest called Sword Quest. And you can see Halliday's hunt here, referenced by his avatar, Anorak the All-Knowing. But most of our information comes to us from Wade Watts, our central narrator, because this is a first-person narrative text. But we have to ask the question, how trustworthy is Wade Watts? I'm not suggesting he's a liar, but Wade is a young man, and young men are prone to hyperbole or exaggeration at times, much like Huckleberry Finn, the sort of classic untrustworthy narrator, or as they say here, the unreliable narrator. Wade Watts isn't purposefully lying to us, but he may mislead us because of his unique perspective. Now, an unreliable narrator's credibility is somewhat compromised, and the term itself came into vogue in 1961. While an unreliable narrator almost always operates in the first person, it can be very evident, setting up the story itself as a frame device with which the narrator appears as a character, with clues to his or her unreliability. And I suspect that's the case with Wade. Specifically, he appears as a version of an unreliable narrator referred to as the naif, a narrator whose perception is immature or limited through their point of view. But I ask a question here. Does Wade's point of view change as the book progresses? So let's get into now level 1, chapter 1, Old School. Even though he's a 21st century boy, Wade loves to calm himself after he is woken up by unprecedented, unsuspected gunfire, not unprecedented at all. As he says here, rather, as a counterpoint, gunfire wasn't uncommon in the stacks, but still shook him up. So he sort of uses the video game method of approaching these older pieces like Asteroids, Defender, Galaga to calm himself down. And that might seem silly, but actually research has suggested that playing games like Tetris immediately after a traumatic event can help minimize the damage, the deep sort of mental strife and frustration that is associated with a horrific event. So poverty gets a remodel in 2045. Okay, and of course, we're talking about the stacks here, which we saw earlier in the presentation. As he says here, the rest of the trailer reeked of cat piss and abject poverty. Now, we've got 15 people living in one double-wide trailer, and the trailers are stacked about 15 units high. And again, even this situation could be tense for a young man or anybody and could raise their levels of cortisol. It could create blood pressure issues, stress issues, all of which have a negative overall impact on someone's health. So again, Wade, like many people in 2045, fight stress vis-a-vis video games. But why video games? He says, playing old video games never failed to clear my mind and set me at ease. And there, inside the game's two-dimensional universe, life was simple, as referenced by one of his favorite games, Robotron 2084. If you're not familiar with Robotron 2084, it's a version of Smash TV. So the other thing that Wade seems to imbibe in, along with so many other people in this timeline, is the purity of escapism. Sometimes the problems of the world seem too big, so Wade tends to just use the ostrich approach, meaning he avoids them altogether by sticking his head into the past. This is, again, part of what was referred to in that cycle of 30 years, or every story is the same. So, Wade's ready to revisit an era not too far afield from his own parents, but mostly an era that was revisited and deeply loved by his hero, James Halliday. And I have this kind of what I hope to be a funny graphic here. And it's a question for you to ponder. One of the first big questions that we're going to think about with relationship to this book. Do we in 2021 avoid problems that might lead to the version of Wade's world that we see in the novel? Gaining access to all that information turned out to be something of a mixed blessing, because that was when I found out the truth, Wade says. And again, when you find out the truth, you've got this image of Ben Kenobi with Han Solo here from Star Wars. And Han Solo famously says, there's no mystic force controlling my destiny. And, Ben Kenobi gives him those knowing looks. And then years later, we jump ahead to Ben Solo, named after Ben Kenobi, who very much ends up controlling the destiny of his father, who is affected by this omnipresent power known as the Force. And that leads into Wade and his shenanigans as a hero. He's clearly cast in the mold, even up to the idea of the design of his name. And he writes that his dad liked names that sounded like the secret identity of a superhero, such as Peter Parker over here, aka Spider-Man, or Clark Kent, Superman. He even refers to his van in the stacks, his hideout, as his fortress of solitude or his bat cave. When he was there, he attended school, did homework, read books, watched movies, and played video games. It was also where I conducted my ongoing quest to find Halliday's Easter egg. And I love that line because that is an acknowledgement of someone like Luke Skywalker looking into that horizon, curious about what his destiny will be. And that, my friends, is the call to adventure. The hunt for Halliday's Easter egg began. That was what saved me, I think. Suddenly, I'd found something worth doing, a dream worth chasing. For the last 5 years, the hunt had given me a goal and a purpose, a quest to fulfill, a reason to get up in the morning, something to look forward to. So, as any hero who hearkens to the call of adventure, he's got to be prepared with certain tools. And we see the mythical Excalibur, the sword and the stone here. But we see a sort of different set of tools given to Wade. He has a school-issued Oasis console, haptic gloves, which create sensory perception in the Oasis, and a visor, which fully immerses him in the visual reality of the Oasis. Accessing the Oasis, also known as the ontologically anthropocentric sensory immersive simulation, requires some goggles, not unlike those a swimmers might wear, which they blocks out all light, elastic sensory haptic gloves, small earbuds, a microphone to pick up his vocals, and a login sequence. First, the visor scans his retinas, and he repeats a login passphrase, the first reference of many such pop culture moments being the call lines from The Last Starfighter. You have been recruited by the Star League to defend the frontier against Zur and the Kodan Armada. But Wade is not alone in the quest. As he has a goal, find Halliday's Easter egg, he has to recruit some friends, which leads us to level 1, chapter 2. Wade's avatar is equipped at the beginning with things like textbooks, a flashlight, and a few freebies from Oasis, a short iron sword, a small bronze shield, and a suit of banded leather. Wade is in the you phase of the typical story structure or story circle, but he still needs help, right? You need something, right? This is a flashback to that lecture about all stories being the same. If you haven't done that, stop the video here and go back and watch that so you know what I'm talking about. So you exist and you need something. You need to find Halliday's egg. So he goes into the threshold, the chaos or special world. He goes into the Oasis, literally. So let's talk a little bit about his avatar. In the Oasis, he creates an idealized self, much like a superhero. He selects the name Parzival which is a reference to Christian de Troyes' 12th century version of Arthur and his Knights of the Round Table. Specifically, he picks the name of Percival or Parzival, the Arthurian knight who quests for the Holy Grail. Now we've got the first of many sort of Christian themes that overlap throughout the book, right? Halliday's egg is an Easter egg that's associated with the Christian doctrine of belief in one God and his representative son as Jesus as the Godhead. But interestingly, Wade makes no bones about the fact that he himself is an atheist. He doesn't have a belief system, let alone a Christian belief system like the one shared by his avatar's namesake. So in other versions of this mythology, Parzival is also Percival, or the son of the knight known as Galahad. So this is the grandson, and if you're following this thread, of Lancelot. So Lancelot had a son named Galahad. Galahad had a son named Parzival. And Parzival is, even in the Arthurian story, a knight who has a lot of self-doubt. He doesn't believe he's pure enough to attain the Grail. But then, of course, that's what makes him a perfect candidate. He doesn't have this air of pride or susceptibility to flattery. Right? He doesn't think he's worthy, which is exactly why he is. Now, in chapter 2, we learn a lot about the Oasis school system, which may sort of, I don't know, be less strange for some of us now than it would have been before last year. Because a lot of us have had more than enough experience with the current state of virtual schooling. However, for Wade, it is a boon. He loves going to school in the Oasis. Specifically, he attends public school number 1873 on a planet called Ludus, which is a special planet created in the Oasis, which houses all of the schools available. And it's a much better alternative than, at least according to Wade, than the public school he attended, because he had to avoid, he says in the book, pimps, child pederasts, bullies, and so on and so forth, just traversing from his home in the stacks to public school physically every day. Again, I think there may be a bit of youthful hyperbole here, but if we're talking about a dystopia, perhaps this isn't really as strange as it sounds. Now, one quick side note here. I'm sure that at least some of you have already seen the film adaptation. And if you haven't, maybe you can watch it after you've completed the novel. But the film Ludus is not in the film adaptation that much, though the action in the first 5 chapters of the book takes place on Ludus. We see it in a quick buzz-by in the opening credits of the film, but this may be a treat for those of you who already saw the film, but now get to fill in some background that you didn't receive in the film adaptation. Now, the school requires a little bit of information when registered, but all of this information, because it's available through the Oasis, is restricted in the user's privacy clause, which contains information like Wade's real name, the name of his avatar, his physical mailing address, and his social security number. But at school, things aren't perhaps as open-ended as we might imagine. Despite the fact that the Oasis provides an opportunity for people to be whomever or whatever they want, there are some really boring and kind of tired rules that we might not enforce even in 2021. Wade 3 has to be his username because it has to be something acceptable for the uses of the Oasis school system. He uses one really great comedic example that sticks out in my mind. You can't say, my name's Pimp Grease, teach. No, that doesn't work. Wade 3 is acceptable because there might be 2 other Wades in the school, but Wade 3 would not work, would work where Parzival does not. And he says, for me, in school in the real world has been more of a Darwinian exercise. But in the Oasis, he attends one of the public schools there where he's able to attend things like virtual field trips and even have a virtual locker with virtual desks and other students. Before enrolling in the Oasis public school, his avatar was only allowed to be visible on a planet called Incipio, which is at the center of Sector 1, where all new avatars respond once they were created. But even though in the novel, the Oasis seems like a wonderful place and is exaggerated in the film version, in order to move from place to place, you have to pay to get there. Just like you'd pay for gas or pay for a token from the bus, you've got to pay to move around. Now, you can take a vehicle or teleport, but if you're going to teleport, you've got to be aware of some of the potential dangers. And we'll get to that when we get to chapter 5. We're also introduced to the Sixers, who many of you discussed and responded well to in that first discussion point about plagiarism. Now, IOI, or Innovative Online Industries, is a global communications conglomerate and the world's largest internet service provider. They're also the bad guys for our novel. Roughly equivalent to Comcast, it is the biggest internet service provider in the world, which I'm not saying anything disparaging about Comcast. It's just that that's the real life role that Comcast fulfills. So if you want a reference to what that might look or feel like, Comcast is it for right now. The Sixers, again, are egg hunters or gunters who work for IOI and search for the Easter egg. But unlike those hunters or gunters who are in true pursuit of Halliday's Easter egg, they sign a contract which stipulates that if they found Halliday's egg, the prize would become the sole property of their employer. Lastly, we round out this chapter by hearing a little bit about Artemis. Now, Artemis, of course, is from the Greek pantheon, and she's the goddess of the hunt. She also has a twin brother, and interestingly, the idea that she forms one part of a pair or a triumulative, I think, is something that crosses over a little bit. Now, in popular culture, we can trace this to a character like Wonder Woman, because Artemis in the Greek pantheon becomes Diana in the Roman pantheon. And if you don't know this, a lot of the Roman gods and goddesses were imported from Greece. And so Diana then comes to us in our mythology, or our popular mythology, as Wonder Woman. And she, of course, is fascinated by children and baby animals, because as a goddess of the hunt, she protects animals until they're ready to be mature animals that should be hunted. And if you were to, in ancient Greece, hunt after an animal before it was fully matured, you might risk crossing the wrath of Artemis or Diana. But in this case, she is described a little bit differently. She's obviously one of the best gunters in the game. One of his favorite websites is a blog called Artie's Missives that she writes, And he admits right away to us as readers that it probably goes without saying that he had a huge cyber crush on her. We're also introduced to H and we're allowed to sort of complete the triumvirate of heroes at the end of this chapter. H is Wade's best and only friend. And Wade spends a lot of his time before and after school in H's chat room. Now, I'm going to just quickly transition here to my next PowerPoint. With friends like these, level 1, chapter 3. So H's chat room again is not redesigned, but is designed on the basis of a 1980s basement. It's his hangout, in other words. Now, the mysterious Mr. H is kind of an interesting character. Wade actually has never met H in real life, so he doesn't know who he is or what he looks like, but he does know a little bit about H's avatar. He's a tall, broad-shouldered Caucasian male with dark hair, brown eyes. And H refers to Parzival, or Wade, as Z. Remember that realistically, H doesn't know that much about Wade or Parzival. Now, interestingly, H also attends school on Ludus, but on the opposite side of the planet in the school 1172, and he's a senior, so he's about the same age as Wade. And all we know at this point, a little bit of mystery here, is that like me, Wade expresses, he seemed to spend every waking moment logged into the Oasis. So I assumed he was just as isolated and lonely as I was. Now, H and Wade do not join up with any other Gunter clans. They're just independent operators, but they do team up on occasion. So they have sort of a philosophy that goes counter to what I would assume would be a good idea, which is to team up with as many people as possible to share information, because you may end up getting better tips or tricks from your friends. And plus, the Oasis is basically a massive multiplayer online game, so it's better with friends, man. Now we get into a deep dive in this chapter over the canon, which is referred to as the books, games, films, songs, and TV shows that Halliday was known to have been a fan of. So we're referencing a lot of things in very quick succession. We have the films of Matthew Broderick, probably best known as the titular character of Ferris Bueller, but also, very importantly, for the purposes of this book, he is also the lead in a film called War Games. And specifically for the purposes of the chapter, he was the co-lead along with Rutger Hauer and this young lady here. Well, not so young anymore, but she was sort of a young ingenue when she starred in Lady Hawk, Michelle Pfeiffer. Lady Hawk, interestingly, is the story of a young squire who serves a cursed knight who turns into a wolf at night. Or sorry, he turns into a wolf, at night. And his lady love turns into a hawk in the daytime. So the only time they're ever able to be together is at dawn. Quite a sad story, but they're out to break the curse, maybe with the help of this young page. If you want to know what happens, watch the movie. It's great. We're also we're also told a little bit about Gary Gygax, who created Dungeons and Dragons. And, you know, I'm not a big Dungeons and Dragons fan. I don't know too much about it. I don't dislike it or anything like that. But Dungeons and Dragons is a clear link in what our author, Ernest Cline, sees as a gradual movement from pen and paper creative games like Dungeons and Dragons to video games to the next state of reality, which would be something akin to the Oasis. We also mentioned the Atari game called Tron Deadly Disc, which is a tie-in with the film of the same name, Tron. And the Ewok Adventure, sort of the first Star Wars spinoff. For those of you who may be watching or enjoying The Mandalorian, yeah, it all started here, back in the 80s with the Ewoks' battle for Endor. As it says here, wicked, wicked good. And the festivities are broken up by the intrusion of IROC, a true poser. As Wade explains, he was always trying to impress us with some clue or piece of holiday lore he foolishly believed he'd been the first to discover. But IROC totally sucked at it. He's a poser and ignorant of most of the trivia. Parsifal says, H, why do you let that moron hang out here? But H says, well, his ignorance gives me hope. Because if most of the other Gunters out there are as clueless as IROC, and they are, Z, believe me, that means you and I really do have a shot at winning the contest. Again, we referenced this earlier, but I wanted to go into a little bit more detail. IROC is very excited about the Sword Quest series. Now, this was a real game, or rather a series of games, and a real contest that was launched by Atari of America before the video game implosion of 1984. Now, the idea was a collaboration with DC Comics. So DC Comics would publish a series of comic books, and in the comics there would be clues about how to successfully navigate and win the video games that would be released. And there were 4 of them. Earth World, which is kind of an unofficial sequel to Adventure, interestingly, another key to Robin Warrenet's work. And if you won Earth World, you got the Talisman of Penultimate Truth, which was solid gold with diamonds. That was followed up by Fire World. And if you did well in Fire World, you would win the Chalice of Light, which was, again, a jewel-encrusted cup. And if you beat Water World, you got the Crown of Life, which was, again, a heavily jewel-encrusted crown that was made of gold. And Air World, which was never created because the competition was not finished, as you see here, was the Philosopher's Stone. Now, I believe the Chalice of Light and the Crown of Life and the Talisman of Penultimate Truth were won, and I think the Chalice of Light was actually sold by the winner to pay for college, of all things. So the grand prize was supposed to be a sword, but the contest was canceled. Unfortunately, the comic books did not go over very well, which made playing the games difficult. And as the games successfully came, or as the games came out in succession, they were purchased by fewer and fewer people. And then Atari unfortunately went belly up in 1984 or 82, I believe. And that was it for video games North America. But luckily for us, they were resurrected thanks to the help of Nintendo in the next, I think, 85 or 86. All right. Level 1, Chapter 4, School Days. Wade suspects that his teacher, Mr. Ivanovich, looks like himself in real life. He seemed to be the kind of teacher that enjoyed what he did, and Wade suspects that teachers in the Oasis may have an advantage because they actually like teaching online or in a virtual realm because they don't have to deal with discipline issues. Discipline is rigidly controlled by the OASIS software, and they don't feel like glorified babysitters. Well, I don't know if that's what makes a good professor or good instructor. I think if they were engaging and helpful and they had a real passion for what they were teaching, maybe that would be my qualification for a good instructor. But again, Wade may not be the most reliable of narrators. We're given a little bit of a privy to his school day, and he has a history with Mr. Ivanovich first, and they take a virtual field trip to 1922 where they are there at the discovery of King Tut's tomb. I wonder how much more interesting it would be to feel like you were there in the tomb and then you were able to create for your students or enjoy as a student a kind of virtual field trip anytime you wanted. That would be so nice. That's one feature of virtual learning that I think really could sell students and users on the prospect of getting into this idea. So he talks about other virtual field trips. He goes in biology on a voyage through the human heart. In the art class, he visits the Louvre Museum or recreation thereof. And in astronomy, he's actually able to visit the moons of Jupiter, all within the safety of his own little van or private hideout. While the Ludus schools, the public OASIS schools, are open campus, Wade doesn't have the kind of money necessary to travel. Logging on to the OASIS itself is free, but traveling around is not, he writes. Most of the time, I didn't have enough credits to teleport off-world and get back to Ludus. And if you didn't do that, you could be basically stranded on another planet for a weekend or longer. And if your avatar can't get back to school, it's just like real world school. You have, marks against you for, tardiness or truancy. And if too many of those mound up or if your grades start to slip, you're not canceled or anything. You're just kicked out of school in the OASIS. You're free to go back to your own real world public school. But Wade wants to avoid that like the plague. So rather than, risk venturing away, he sits in a virtual field and enjoys a protein bar looking at the scenery because it beats staring at the inside of his hideout. In terms of the universe in which the OASIS exists, we're told that it resembles a Rubik's Cube, meaning it has 27 cube-shaped sectors. Each sector is about 10 light hours across, and 1 real hour is roughly equivalent to 1 light hour. Each zone, each sector is divided into various zones, and each zone has different rules and parameters. You can read more about that in the text. You can use the OASIS for gaming and entertainment, but also for things like business, shopping, and hanging out with friends. But it's risky if you want to do any of those other fun things, because although it's cheaper to teleport, it's dangerous. You might, he says, for example, find yourself in a sector that's mostly magical. And so if you used a spaceship to get to a magical realm, you might find yourself stranded because that realm runs on magic versus science fiction power of some type or other. But it is faster and you have more options to explore if you do teleport. The other important thing about being active in the OASIS is your experience points, or XP points. They increase an avatar's power level, strength, and abilities. At the beginning of the novel, Wade's only on the 3rd level, where H is all the way above 30. Lastly, one of the things that runs through the book is a theme that we touched upon earlier, which is that the economy in this world has taken a bit of a slide. Specifically in 2007 to 2009, preceding this book's publication in 2012, the United States in particular was inundated by something called the Great Recession, which was a period of marked general decline observed in the national economies globally. Now, not everybody suffered. India, China, and some other third world economies actually stepped up, but most first world economies were deeply impacted by this time. The scale and timing of the recession does vary, which is why there is such a large parameter of years listed here. But it definitely influenced our author, because at the time, the International Monetary Fund concluded that it was the most severe economic and financial meltdown since the Great Depression. And we were not really sure that we were going to pull out of that. Luckily, we did. But I think that fractured and maybe severely frightened Ernest Cline, which is why he sort of started dreaming of what might come next for our civilization. Now, chapter 5, we get to spend a little more time with Halliday and Morrow. So Ogden Morrow was Halliday's only friend, his best friend, sort of the H to Wade's participle. Halliday was simply fascinated by the idea of Dungeons and Dragons, harkening back to that piece of referring to Gary Gygax. But he didn't have any friends, so kind of difficult to play. But Ogden Morrow steps outside of his comfort zone and invites him over. And as it says in the book, there in Morrow's basement, Halliday is introduced to an entire group of mega geeks, just like himself. They immediately accepted him as one of their own. And for the first time in his life, James Halliday had a circle of friends. Later, Morrow became Halliday's business partner and his best friend. Now, this is another interesting note, because we see Halliday and Morrow described as one of a group of mega geeks. And in the late, well, I'd say mid to late 90s and into the early part of the 21st century, mega geeks became the entrepreneurs and leaders of business. Not only do you have people like Bill Gates and Steve Jobs, who I mentioned earlier, but you've got people like Jeff Bezos creating Amazon and Elon Musk rising to prominence with SpaceX and and Tesla. So geeks, in many ways, have become people that save and save the economy and enhance life for many people. And Halliday has done that same thing in this version of the world, in this novel. It's another part of why he's so important. Halliday and Morrow's first game was Anorak's Quest, and was named after his favorite Dungeons and Dragons character. Programmed on in the basic computer language on a TRS-80 color computer, the adventure takes place in the planet Sithonia, which is Planet Doom in the film adaptation. If you've seen that, you're like, I don't remember Sithonia. Well, it's called Planet Doom for some reason. And of course, the games are sold in 5 1/4-inch floppy disks and plastic Ziploc bags, but they sold enough to make a showing of that. Halliday had many well-known obsessions, right? Specifically, his obsessive adherence to his routine and a preoccupation with the few obscure areas of interest led many psychologists to conclude that Halliday suffered from Asperger's syndrome, or another form of high-functioning autism. Despite these potential handicaps, Morrow, or I guess you could say learning disabilities, perhaps that would be more appropriate. Morrow and Halliday went on to form Gregarious Games, which is the name of their company created in 1990 in this fictional timeline. They moved into a, quote, real office, unquote, in a strip mall in Columbus, Ohio, And a few short years later, in December of 2012, Gregarious Games rebranded themselves as Gregarious Simulation Systems. And under this new banner, they launched their flagship product, the Oasis. Now, the Oasis goes through several iterations before it gets to the 2045 version that Wade's participating in. But the year 2012 is simultaneous with the release of this novel, Ready Player One. GSS only charged a one-time sign-up of 25 cents, for which the player receives a lifetime Oasis account. And as we mentioned earlier, you could create yourself an entirely new persona. And I love this passage, but I'm still baffled by why the school system of the Oasis has to sort of enforce these standard rules or regulations upon its students. But in the wider Oasis, as Wade suggests, you could change your name, age, sex, race, height, weight, voice, hair color, and bone structure. Or you could cease being a human altogether and become an elf, an ogre, an alien, or any other creature from literature, movies, or mythology. And that's a fascinating concept. I don't care if you don't like video games at all. This idea, I think, is something that is in the air right now. Now, I'm not a very political person, and I'm not going to get into personal politics or thoughts, but the idea of being able to create an appearance that matches who you feel like you are, or that represents who you are in a larger sense, perhaps a truer sense, question mark, I don't know, is an idea that appeals to many people. And I think there's something kind of healthy in one regard about that potential, and maybe something that's also, as we'll find out in the novel a little bit later, perhaps it's too easy. I don't know. We'll have to see. Now, during the Great Recession, the Oasis became such an integral part of people's day-to-day social lives that users were more than willing to shell out real money to buy accessories for their avatars, including clothing, furniture, houses, flying cars, magic swords, and machine guns. Now, I wanted to throw in a quick visual here from the film iteration of the Oasis and the very real screenshot here from Second Life. Now, if you don't know what Second Life is, it's sort of akin to a real-life Oasis. It was an online virtual world developed and owned by the San Francisco-based firm Linden Lab and launched in 2003. In many ways, I think Klein had a more up-to-date, more revolutionary version of Second Life in mind when he created this story and sort of designed the novel. You could exchange real world money in Second Life for something called Linden dollars, and these Linden dollars could be used to purchase digital equipment or digital creations within the game. Let's say you had a favorite shirt that wasn't available in the digital life. You could have somebody design it, and then you could purchase that design, and you could have a unique piece of clothing that you could wear while you were navigating the Second Life world. And again, talking about how the Oasis advances, we're going to wrap up with a quick discussion of a theme called, or a concept called, latency. So Wade explains that there were older versions of the Oasis dating, as it says here, back to 2012, okay? So older systems had some limitations. If too many people were logged in, the simulation would slow to a crawl and the avatars would freeze. But in the new improved version that Wade inhabits, it utilized a new kind of fault-tolerant server array, which could draw additional processing power from every computer connected to it, which meant it could handle up to 5 million simultaneous users at the time of its initial launch. So that version is the up-to-date version that Wade is rocking in our novel. So that's about it. That means you're all caught up. You should have read up to chapter 5 for this week, and I've assigned a couple of additional chapters for you to read. I think it's 6 to 8, if I remember correctly. If not, check the syllabus to make sure that I'm not in error. But we've talked a lot already today, and one last note, if throughout the week you're having concerns, difficulties getting started on that draft, or you just want to reach out and ask a question, feel free to do so. I'm always available to my students. It may take me a little bit of time to get back to you, but I'll be on the lookout, especially this week. Okay, that's it for today. Take care, and until next time, keep reading and keep thinking critically. Bye-bye, everybody.